In this video, I will provide you with how you can put an overhang around your trapezoid shaped building or a building with odd angles for the exterior walls instead of walls that are at a 90-degree angle or perpendicular to the other walls. And of course, I tried to make this as simple as possible, and I'm not sure that I actually did it. And if for whatever reason this looks a little too difficult, let me know and I'll give it another shot. And I do have a couple of more ideas. However, I'm not 100% sure that the building would be affordable anymore, especially with lumber prices like they are today in 2022. And for those of you wondering if lumber prices are going to go down, they probably will, because we're probably going to be going into a recession here pretty soon. And I don't know what's worse, high lumber prices or a recession, so we will find out. And for those of you who watched the first video, I suggested another alternative method for installing the fascia board, and I think this might help. So instead of bringing these joists out to a corner and creating an angle that would be difficult for us to cut with a circular saw, I simply added another piece of fascia board to create a couple of angles that will be easier to cut with your circular saw. And of course, you could always take this angle here and drop it down to the building foundation if you don't like this sharp angle here. Again, trying to make things a little easier for most do-it-yourselfers. And of course, we are going to be using a cantilevered beam here to support this corner. And this is where we're going to have most of our problem, will be the back corner and not the front corner here. And again, this is not the only way to build something like this. And of course, our cantilevered beam is not going to be coming out 1/3 and going back 2/3. However, I do have a way to make that happen if you need it. And our fascia board will be sitting on top of the cantilevered beam. And I went ahead and put a decorative edge around the front of the beam here to make it look a little more appealing. And again, you can see here where we're not coming out 1/3 and going back 2/3. So for example, if I'm coming out 18 inches, I should be going back 36 inches instead of about 10 inches. And don't forget, I'm not providing viewers with a building that will work everywhere all the way around the world, and that you will need to check with your local building department, building authorities, and structural engineers to make sure that something like this will work, especially in areas where it snows. And you will be dealing with heavy loads of snow sitting on top of your roof. And of course, our lookouts will be sitting on top of a notched 2x10 or a rafter that will be the same size as our other rafters. Next up, let's take a look at the notch. And your notch might need to be a little deeper than 3.5 inches if you're using 2x4s, because you're still going to have a high and a low point. And the reason for that is because we are dealing with an angled roof. So you might need to make it 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch deeper. And you could always fix this by putting a little bit of an angle in this notch. However, it's not going to be the end of the world if you end up with a lookout that's a little bit higher, because you could always shave it down with a hand planer or maybe even a belt sander. Next up, let's go ahead and take a look at this rafter here and how it is shaped. And since we are going to be running the grain of the plywood in this direction, we're going to need to install another rafter board, something that is going to be parallel to the other rafters. And this rafter here will basically be teetering on top of the beam. And something like this might not make your engineer happy. However, it will provide them with another option. Now let's go ahead and take everything apart and start rebuilding this. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild it in order, or at the very least, something that I think will get you going in the right direction. So we're going to start by installing our first beam. And since we're going to be using 2x4s for our rafters, for this fill area here, not our main rafters, you're probably going to need to reduce the size of the beam. For example, a 4x6 might not work. That's 5.5 inches wide. However, if you needed something that was going to be 5.25 inches, you could simply cut 1/4 of an inch out of a 4x6. And if it was going to be 5 3/4 inches, you could always add 1/4 of an inch piece of plywood underneath the beam to raise it up to the desired location. Now, something else you might have a problem with will be figuring out where this cut is going to go. And if that's the case, then go ahead and install a longer beam, something that's going to be a little bit longer, and then you could shape it later. And since we're not 20 feet off of the ground, you shouldn't have a problem doing that. If, however, for example, this was going to be a 2-story or a 3-story building, then you might need to shape this before you install it. Go ahead and install our first rafter and our first midspan block. And keep in mind that the bottom of the rafter is going to notch over the beam. And this isn't going to be a problem because this part of the rafter is going to be sitting on top of the shaped board here, providing us with full bearing on the joist. And for those of you who have noticed, I installed a strap here and tied it to the 2x4. And you can always put a strap on both sides, or install a couple of more studs and add a few more straps. Since we're not going to be working with our standard 1/3 out, 2/3 back cantilever. However, I do have another option for that, and that would be to extend the length of the beam a little further and then shape this rafter in the same way you'd be shaping this rafter. And that's going to look something like this. Except we are going to add a hanger on the other side here so that we can support the bottom of this roof rafter. So we're getting at least 3.5 inches coming out here to pick up the fascia board and support it by notching around the beam, but we are going to need a hanger in there. And in my opinion, this method here is probably going to be easier to build, cheaper, and create a stronger roof. However, as always, I will leave that up to you. Next up, let's go ahead and install another rafter, and then our next rafter, and then we can go ahead and install our back beam. And again, if you want to run this beam a little bit farther back, then shape this end of the rafter and then install your hanger in the same way we did it in the front. Now I went ahead and installed a longer strap in the back and a 4x4, and then went ahead and moved this strap over a little bit. So the strap on this side is going to line up with this edge of the 4x4, and the strap on the other side is going to line up with the other end of the 4x4. And I'm doing this to prevent the wood from splitting. Next up, let's go ahead and install our rim joist with the notches in it for our lookouts. And I spaced mine 32 inches on center. However, you could always take the overall length of this board and then divide it into units of your preferred measurements also. Go ahead and install our lookouts. And the way that I designed this here was to prevent me from notching too much out of these 3 joists here. So in other words, if I wanted to notch right here in the same way that I'm doing this, I could go ahead and run this all the way back to here. However, I would severely weaken the roof rafter here, and that could create a structural problem for the building. Next up, let's go ahead and install our fascia board. And you can see this angle here is not going to be too difficult to cut. And we will need to install some blocks over the beam to help provide us with some perimeter nailing. A view from the bottom there. And another view of the rafter, how it's going to be sitting on top of the beam from below. Next up, let's go ahead and head over to the other side, where I went ahead and took one of our lookout boards and notched it into the top of this roof rafter. And I don't think we're going to have a problem here with our engineer because the span of this right here is less than 5 feet, allowing us to use a 2x6. And if we take 3.5 inches out of a 2x10, we're still going to have 6 inches. However, that might not be the case with this rafter or this rafter. And to solve that problem, the engineer might allow you to double these rafters up, or even allow you to install larger lumber like a 4x10. And I wanted to wrap this video up by providing you with a view of this here, just in case you think the other option isn't going to work. For those of you who have no interest at all at hiring a structural engineer, and of course will worry about the consequences later if anything ever happens to your building. So let's go ahead and throw our sheathing on there and wrap this video up. Any questions? or wonderful comments that inspired me to make this second video will always be sincerely appreciated, and make sure you leave those in the comment area for all of the other viewers to read, and then that will inspire them to tell everyone they know about our channel.